Hey, folks, welcome to the Rob Breakenridge Show. So great to have you along with us. Direct democracy has been a real hot topic in Alberta as of late. Of course, Alberta has two direct democracy tools, one being voter recall, which allows citizens to recall or essentially fire an elected official. The other is citizen initiative, the idea that if enough folks want to see a question posed in a referendum, they can make that happen. Now, so far, we haven't seen either of these tools actually succeed in being put to use. We haven't seen a politician recalled, and we haven't seen a referendum yet on a particular issue. But that could soon change. In fact, it's looking possible that in 2026, we could see a whole bunch of recall elections and referendums, some of which we've talked about on this program, the voter recall push. In fact, as of this week, as of we record this podcast, there are now 14 approved petitions, all targeting UCP MLAs for recall. Now, of course, those petitions need to get enough signatures, and even if they do, there's still the hurdles of a recall vote and then, of course, a by-election. But that's happening on that side. So 14 petitions. We've also got possible referendums. Thomas Lukaszuk, who we've spoken to on this program, his Forever Canadian group, they appear to have far exceeded the petition threshold, although it's possible that that could be dealt with in the Alberta legislature, their question, their anti-separatist question, or perhaps it might actually go to a referendum. Certainly the separatists do want to try to put this question to a referendum, although there are some technicalities in the rules about the same question being on separate petitions. You can only have one petition per issue, basically. But anyway, so there's that issue. That could be a petition or a referendum next year. There's also an approved petition regarding private school funding, public dollars going to private schools in Alberta. So that's in the signature collection phase. That could be another. The Alberta Federation of Labor recently came out and said there's three separate issues they want to try to force a referendum on, one being use of the notwithstanding clause, the other being the Canada Pension Plan, and also a question on minimum wage. So if those petitions were to succeed, there's three other issues Albertans could be voting on next year. There's another, though, that could find itself in the mix, and that being the issue of coal policy in Alberta, and specifically whether Alberta should allow coal mining and coal development in the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. And this has been a real hot-button issue. And it's a real debate between, on the one side, the economic development that goes along with that sort of thing, but also the real concern about environmental impact, and specifically when it comes to possible water contamination from coal development. And so when you got communities and industries, ranchers that are downstream from these developments, not just the water that they use for agriculture, but drinking water and the possible impact, that's a big issue and a big concern. And the Alberta government has tried to argue that there's a balance here, that they can balance all of these concerns. But this has been a real mess, this whole approach to coal policy. And they managed to have angered both sides along the way. Now, back in 2020, the Alberta government very quietly rescinded the Alberta government's coal policy that had been in effect for decades, in fact, going back to Peter Lougheed. It's important to distinguish, too, because we also had, during the previous NDP government, what we refer to as a coal phase-out. But, of course, that has to do with burning coal for electricity generation. The coal policy we're talking about, the kind of coal mining we're talking about, is the coal that's used to make steel. So these are kind of separate issues, but I think maybe they get a little bit confused or conflated in some of the public discourse. So the coal policy that was rescinded in 2020 applied to this coal that is used to make steel. So once that policy was rescinded, there were some applications that come in, and companies that were eager to develop these resources. Amid the controversy, though, the Alberta government did an abrupt about-face and basically reinstated that policy in 2022. So that resulted in some lawsuits. And in fact, just this year, the Alberta government has been settling with some of these companies, and that's costing taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars just to settle those disputes. Along the way, there was a controversial proposal regarding Grassy Mountain. And this was something that was rejected a few years ago by a federal provincial panel, but the issue hasn't gone away. In fact, the Australian company behind this project is trying again. They're in the process of filing a new application for the Grassy Mountain project. And I think that's been a particular focus with some of this opposition and the concern about, again, contamination of water and pollution and the effects downstream. Earlier this year, there were some town hall meetings on this issue that were very well attended, and we're quite heated at times because of the very real and legitimate concerns around all of this. And one of the things the premier had said at the time in the face of all of this pushback was, well, there's one option you can pursue, and that is citizen initiative. The idea that if you folks can get enough signatures and you really want to see some change or a new law or policy, you could try to force a referendum. And so that brings us to our next conversation. Alberta country music artist Corb Lund, who has deep roots in Alberta and deep roots in the ranching industry and community, has kind of been at the forefront of this. And he's almost in some ways been the main face or the voice in raising some of these concerns around these coal mining projects and some of the potential implications that it could mean for ranchers, for communities downstream, for the drinking water, etc. So he's taking up the premier's challenge, you might say. The premier thinks that opponents of coal development are those that want to see a new policy and a new law to protect the eastern slopes. If she thinks they should take this to the people, try to force a referendum, well, that's what they're going to do. So last week in Edmonton, Corb Lund submitted all of the paperwork to Elections Alberta. They have to approve that petition before they can start gathering signatures. And I mentioned all the other petitions going on right now. Elections Alberta does seem kind of swamped at the moment, and that's part of the challenge in all of this. But assuming that petition is approved, the clock would start ticking. And the threshold now, remember, the Alberta government made it easier to get a question on the ballot or to recall a politician. So now the threshold is about 177,000 signatures that need to be gathered within a certain time. So the clock's not yet ticking because this petition is not yet approved, but I would imagine that's right around the corner. Last week, the Alberta premier was asked about this issue and this petition drive and Corb Lund's efforts specifically. Here's what Danielle Smith had to say.
Country singer Corb Lund recently announced that he's starting a citizens initiative to hold a referendum against coal mining. He credited you as part of the inspiration for wanting to do that. Could you comment on that?
Oh, maybe he'll write a song about me. I'm glad I'm able to be his muse. I support citizen-initiated referenda. I think it's really important that people have their say. So the rules are out there, and I'll watch with great interest. But what I can say is that, we heard the message. That's why we changed the coal policy. No open pit mining, no mountaintop removal, high standards for addressing the issues around selenium, which is a problem with any type of mining when you do end up exposing the surface. We've seen a number of mining operations now switch to underground mining, which is fantastic. We want to see more of that. And we've also been engaging with the companies that are suing us to buy back the leases and the freehold rights. We already have 30,000 hectares of freehold and mineral leases for coal that are now back in Crown hands. And so we'll continue to have those negotiations to make sure that we're protecting our pristine areas. But I think the world knows I think most people know that there's a big difference with metallurgical coal. You need it to make steel. And if you love the renewable sector, there's a lot of steel that goes into making wind turbines. If you love the solar industry, you need the coal to be able to make those panels. So we believe that if those are the kinds of investments that those on the left would like to see, then they're going to have to also support some of the mining operations that allow for those, as well as all the mining operations that allow for batteries to be produced. So we have a challenging conversation going. I totally get that. But we are going to find the right balance to make sure that we're protecting the environment, but also allowing those projects to go ahead. And we'll see what kind of reaction he gets to his petition.
All right. Well, joining us now for more on the debate around coal mining in the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains, the possibility, too, that Albertans could have a direct say on this issue next year, is someone who's been actively involved in this issue, a sixth-generation Albertan, deep roots in the ranching community, and, of course, also an award-winning country music artist from right here in Alberta, Corb Lund, joining us on the program. Corb, great to have you back with us.
Yeah, how you doing, Rob?
Doing really good. So let's just get a sense of where things are at. In recent weeks, or the last couple of months anyway, we've seen a couple of lawsuits settled by the government, some pretty big payouts to these companies. Sounds like there's another application brewing here for the Grassy Mountain project. Where do things stand right now?
Yeah, Grassy, we've been fighting it for 6 years. It's at the headwaters of the Old Man River near Crow's Nest Pass. It was turned down by the federal government and the provincial government as not being in the public interest a few years ago. They appealed it 2 or 3 times in court. The appeals weren't heard. Polling time after time shows that 70% plus of Albertans don't want mines there. And still, the government is grinding away in the background, pushing to allow them to mine. And there was a lot of controversy about why they were allowed to reapply. There was some controversy about Brian Jean directly inserting himself into that situation, which is not supposed to be the way it is. Anyway, that's one thing. The other thing is that, they put the coal policy back in place for the time being, but we've all seen that policies can be changed and revoked and reinstated at the drop of a hat. So we need legislation. We need specific legislation with teeth, which is much harder to change. And meanwhile, behind the scenes, they're developing a new policy called CIMI. It's CIME. It's the Coal Industry Modernization Initiative, I believe. But it's so far being done with hardly any public input, hardly any conservation input. Most all the inputs been industry. So that could be announced any day, and that's going to replace the coal policy. So what we're asking for in this citizens initiative, for once and for all, after 6 years of fighting this stuff, we're asking for clear legislation that prohibits any kind of new coal mining in the eastern slopes of the Rockies.
Right. And of course, Alberta has legislation that allows this to be put to a referendum if enough Albertans are on board with that. And it's interesting because this goes back to earlier this year, right? In one of these town hall meetings where basically this is kind of what the premier, I don't know, almost challenged or dared you to do.
Well, she said over and over that she's a fan of citizen initiatives, but yeah, I was at the town hall in Fort Macleod, and it was pretty rowdy in there. There was a pretty large majority of people who were very concerned about the coal situation, and she finally stood up and said, "If you folks don't want coal, you should have start a citizens initiative." So I did that. I got a legal team together, and we've got a ground team together, and we're just now. I applied last week. We're just waiting for approval from Elections Alberta. I'm not sure. I'm happy to answer questions. There were a few things that Premier Smith said in response when she was asked about the.
I did want to ask you about her comments last week.
Yeah, I'd like to address some of those things. One of the things she said, first of all, I'll give the government credit for buying back those leases. I think that's a good move, both freehold and lease land. I think they paid too much for it, but I don't know, whatever. I'd rather have that than messed up water that's going to cost our grandkids billions of dollars to fix. So I'll give them credit for that. I think that's a step in the right direction. But a number of the things she said don't add up. One of them is that she said that they've stopped, what'd she say? Open pit mining and mountaintop removal mining. The thing is, number one, all she did and all the ministers have done is say it in press conferences. We need legislation because they can change that any day, and they have many times. Secondly, they've been playing with word games around the types of mines because for a while, after 6 years, I've heard surface mining, strip mining, highwall mining, mountaintop removal mining. There's a whole list, and underground mining. And the fact is, Albertans, number one, just don't trust the government anymore. We just don't want any mines, period. And underground mines are not a solution. They're probably slightly better than the surface mining options, but they still release selenium into the water. And in fact, the most recently approved mine, it's called Mine 14, Valerie Mining is doing it. It's near Grand Cache. Their own literature predicts that they're going to release more selenium than the Alberta surface water guidelines allow for. And the AER allowed them to do it anyway, and that was also incidentally the project where the CEO of the AER unilaterally just decided to cancel the public hearing. So they said, we don't need a public hearing. They canceled it, and let this underground mine go ahead, which in its own documentation says it's going to release too much selenium. So underground mining is not a solution, and no matter what the mining companies say, selenium is still an unsolved problem. It takes hours and hours to get into the fine details, but the long and the short of it is, technically it's possible to remove selenium from these issues, but it's not practical because the only possible way to do it would be so economically unviable that it's virtually impossible. Yet the mining companies would say, "Oh, we can do it. We have new technology coming." We just kept saying, "Show us. Give me 10 examples somewhere in the world that this has not caused selenium contamination," and so far, crickets. I don't mean to be negative or pessimistic, but if anybody out there doesn't think that, I'm not anti-industry, but we all know that resource companies, they make all kinds of promises, and then once they get approval, they cut corners and they they just do things that are not correct, and they just eat the fines, and, they push the government and they push the boundaries. So, my prediction is they'll say, oh, we have technology, which is in the first place not viable. And then once they get the permits, they just, they fudge the numbers and they cheat. It's just gross. And I don't mean to be negative, but 6 years of this stuff has made me quite a cynic about this whole process.
Well, yeah. Well, let's talk about the issue of selenium pollution and why that's such a threat to water, not just for ranchers, obviously, but for everybody downstream. In this case, in southern Alberta, what's the danger and the risk then of selenium contamination?
Well, the immediate danger is the fish are the canary in the coal mine, pardon the pun, but the fish are the first thing you see contaminated. And then it bioaccumulates from there. And Lethbridge is downstream from the Oldman River. There are 200,000 people that drink water out of that river. So they talk about the jobs in the past, and I get it. Like, I'm not a child. I know we need jobs, but it's also childish to pretend that the word jobs is a magic wand that you wave and it mitigates all other effects and factors in the equation. Like, every situation has to be looked at differently. My understanding is we're looking at a couple of hundred jobs, probably in a boom bust industry. And, it's going to affect ag for sure and tourism for sure. And there's 200,000 people using the water to drink. My mother drinks the water. I drink the water right out of the Old Man. There's a multi-billion-dollar food processing industry in Lethbridge. I just think this thing is short-sighted. And, this is anecdotal, but I've been on this thing for years. And the only people that I've run into that are really enthusiastic about these mines are either in the government, work for the coal companies, or a handful of people in the past who want the jobs. And I have sympathy for people who need jobs, but that's not a be-all end-all that solves all problems.
It's interesting because I think a lot of Albertans are a little bit removed from this, so they wouldn't necessarily be directly impacted by this. And so when the government or even industry talks about, all these upsides, right, the jobs or the royalties, or just, that we need these materials to build steel and how important that is, all these arguments, that might sound persuasive to Albertans who don't maybe fully understand these issues or aren't directly impacted by these issues.
That's right. And, the steel issue is correct. We do need steel. My answer to that is, there are techniques being used now that don't use coal to make steel. Scandinavia is doing it. China's doing it. It's a sunset industry. Number two, there's a guy, Tech Mining from BC, looked at these deposits a number of years ago and passed on them. And I've spoken for hours at length to the engineer, he's a 40-year coal engineer. He's worked on 5 continents. He's an expert in coal engineering. He personally assessed the coal deposits for Tech and found that they weren't marketable for steel making. He's famous for saying it's shit coal. He says it's not good for steel making. So if all the other problems that we're talking about are in place, the economics don't make sense, and the coal's no good, what the hell are we doing here? And I don't understand. Again, I don't mean to be a cynic, but the motivations behind this, I don't understand them. And, I'd like to talk about the economics beyond the jobs, because, like I said, it's going to affect agriculture, it's going to affect tourism. And incidentally, this narrative that it's only the left crazies that are against this is getting a bit old, because the people that brought me into this were cattle producers west of Manton. And a lot of ranchers don't like this. A lot of irrigating farmers don't like it. A lot of hunters, a lot of anglers, guides, outfitters. Anyway, the effect it could have on those economies is bad. So you have to weigh that against the handful of jobs. The royalty rate is tiny. The biggest, put all that aside. I stake my reputation that if we let this thing go through 10, 20, 30 years from now, the taxpayer is going to be stuck with billions of dollars to clean it up. That's just the way it goes. We all know it deep in our hearts. We're going to pay for it at the end. So if you factor that in, it doesn't make any sense economically.
So let's talk about the petition. I guess, first of all, so what would the question be then that would be posed to Alberta?
I don't have the exact wording in front of me, but it's very close to, we would like the Alberta government to prohibit all new coal mines and coal mining activity anywhere in the eastern slopes of the Rockies. It's pretty simple.
So, is there coal that's elsewhere in Alberta? If the policy is specific to the eastern slopes, would it still allow for developments elsewhere in the province?
We're asking for the eastern slopes. New mining in the Eastern Slopes. And we've worded it specifically, incidentally, to include Grassy Mountain, because based on my dealings with these people for 6 years, I'm sure they're going to try and carve out Grassy. So we've worded it specifically to include Grassy Mountain.
So you were in Edmonton last week. The paperwork was submitted. So before you can actually hit the ground running, start gathering signatures, what needs to happen?
We need to get approval on our application from Elections Alberta, and that can come up to 30 days from now. We have we're not taking any steps until we get that, because we need to follow the rules. But the sentiment around this is pretty strong.
Yeah,
and I gotta say too, I'm not enjoying this process. I've probably spent 35 or 40% of my productive time in the last 5 or 6 years on this thing. And, I ask people to think about two things. I would say I'm not partisan. I'm not affiliated or affection. I don't have no affection for any of the parties, really. And if you're a UCP voter, I'm not telling you who to vote for. It's a democracy. But what I would say is it's totally okay to tell your own people when they made a mistake on a particular issue. That's what's happening here.
Yeah. Well, and I think almost, just the fact that the government has kind of gone back and forth on this and sort of taken different positions suggests that it is possible to go in a different direction, to adjust things when circumstances warrant. So it wouldn't be unprecedented here.
No, of course not. And, the constant changes and flip-flopping and confusion over the last 5 or 6 years, that's one of the things that's driven us to ask for legislation. We need specific, robust legislation that stops coal mining in the Eastern Slopes, period. No highwall mining, no underground mining, no blah, 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 blah. Change the word every 5 minutes, mining. Just no mining. It's very simple.
Is that what we had before? Of course, we used to have the coal policy going back to the Lougheed years before that was rescinded. Are we kind of restoring that then?
Well, the coal policy that Lougheed put in place was quietly rescinded in 2020, as most of us remember. And, different, like I think Minister Savage put it back in, and then it's been changed and tweaked and put in and out a number of times. At the moment, according to Premier Smith, it's in place. But, if they can tweak that on a whim on a Friday night with no warning constantly, like, that's not good enough. We need legislation. And what they say in the press, like they've made promises in the media, that's just smoke. That they can change that tomorrow morning. We need legislation. So
I mentioned you were in Edmonton to drop off the paperwork. Was there an attempt to also have a conversation with the Premier or anyone in government? Have they been willing to engage at all through this?
I haven't talked to Premier Smith. I've talked to a number of the ministers on it, both the last administration and the current one. I didn't this past week. No, I was just focused on getting the application in and dropping it off at Elections Alberta. It's a formality. It's just a staffing process. You just sign the paper and give them the fee, and that's it. So no, I haven't spoken to them for a while. I will say that. Again, I'm not picking on any particular party, but these happen to be the people I've been talking to about this. I hate to say this, but they didn't really know much about it. Like, they've slowly gained a little more knowledge, but the first meetings I had in the early days were shocking. Like, they just don't know what they're talking about. And I think I get the impression from their answers that the only people giving them information are the coal companies. And sorry if I sound a bit exasperated, but I keep telling people, listen, the people who've educated themselves about this coal thing and who are against it are not getting paid. I'm not getting paid, certainly. The ranchers, the Langs, the Bladeses, the Schlossers, the people I know, Weston Nanton that brought this to me are not getting paid. They've got cattle to raise. Nobody on stopping the coal and keeping the water clean side is getting paid. Everybody else is getting paid on the other side. And all of the scientists that we talk to who have completely different conclusions, miraculously, than the scientists that the coal companies pay for, like they're just, independent scientists. And on the other side, you've got, $1 billion coal companies that are funded by $1 billion deep-pocketed Australian coal magnate. You've got scientists working for them, teams of lawyers, and a government who seems to only listen to them. And they're coming up with completely different conclusions than we are. So, I just got to say, I can't ask you to believe me or the people I'm working with, but I got nothing to gain in this thing. Like, I really don't. Frankly, the only foreign, we spoke earlier about left, right. This is quite a wide coalition of people, urban, rural, First Nations, left, right. And, this is not left-leaning foreign extremists. The only foreign money in any of this is the coal companies. And like, we've been accused of all kinds of crazy stuff, and we're just Albertans. I'm not affiliated with any groups. I work with all kinds of people, but I'm just a guy who thinks this is a horrible idea.
So the threshold in the legislation would be, I think it's around 177,000 signatures you would need. And then maybe there's an opportunity to send more of a message if you can kind of blow past that target. But what would you be aspiring for in the petition phase?
Yeah, I'd like to beat that for sure. I'm confident we can get 177,000. I'm kind of confident we can get a lot more than that. I think a lot of this has to do with, it's sort of a public conversation with the government. And I think the more signatures we get, the better. And it's premature for me to ask for people to canvass for signatures, so I'm not going to do it. But I don't want to break any rules. But when our application is approved, assuming it is approved by Elections Alberta, we will be immediately attempting to sign up as many canvassers as we can get. And that's an official process, and we're going to follow all the rules very carefully and just hit the ground and start putting together names.
Then there's a challenge too, assuming the petition succeeds and we get to a referendum at some point, there's making sure that Albertans, if they're going to be having a say right across the province, that Albertans are aware and understand all of these issues. So that's going to be quite a challenge too.
It is. One of the things that will come of this entire process is, we've been doing our best to talk about this issue and convince people, especially conservative voters. And a lot of them, when they actually start looking at it, realize that they've made a mistake on this. But, that's been our job, is to educate people. And, if people look at all the same stuff I've looked at and read all the same articles and talk to all the same people and come to the conclusion that coal's a great idea, okay, but I haven't met many. And so the referendum process or the citizens initiative process will bring that, educating the public level or making people aware to a much higher level. So that's part of the goal of this, is to, just keep talking about why it's a bad idea and calmly explain to people that I'm not anti-industry and I'm not a crazy lefty. It's just this particular idea is not a good one, and it doesn't smell right.
Yeah, we'll await some further word from Elections Alberta, see where this all goes from here. More to your website, of course, corblund.com. Corb, we'll keep a close eye on how this all plays out and touch base down the road. But for now, appreciate you making some time for us here.
You bet. Thanks, Dave. Appreciate it, Rob.
All right. Well, our thanks once again to Alberta country musician Corb Lund. As mentioned, he's devoted a lot of time and effort to this cause, and with a potential petition campaign and then a potential referendum, that's certainly going to be, I think, even more of a commitment from him. But clearly it's something he's passionate about, as are a lot of Albertans. So we'll see what comes of all of this, both in terms of the government's new direction or what this new policy looks like. Are they prepared to approve this new Grassy Mountain application or perhaps other applications? And then, of course, there's the cost of resolving some of these previous lawsuits. So still a lot to be sorted out when it comes to coal policy. And Albertans may have a say next year. I think the challenge for opponents of the government's approach here, those who want to see restrictions around coal development in the eastern slopes, is making sure Albertans understand all of these concerns. Because like I said to Corb, I think those that are kind of removed from it wouldn't be necessarily impacted by some of these environmental issues. They might just see it through the lens of the economic impact, the jobs or the royalties or these kinds of things that will go along with that. And certainly Albertans really, I think, do, for the most part, embrace the idea that we've got natural resources. We should allow those to be developed, and that can certainly be to our economic benefit. So I think you need to make sure folks understand all of these issues if it's going to go to a province-wide referendum, which would be the idea here. So again, we'll see what comes of the Alberta government's current approach to coal policy, what happens with this specific referendum petition, not to mention all the others. As I stated at the outset, we're now up to, as of this recording, 14 recall petitions, a handful potentially of referendum petitions. And maybe in the midst of all of this, the Alberta government just decides to go early and have an election next year instead of 2027. I mean, Danielle Smith had already talked about some of the issues that she potentially wanted to put to a referendum next year, things stemming from the Alberta Next panel. So I don't know. Does it make sense to have a dozen or more votes next year potentially, and then followed by an election? Or maybe is an election one way to kind of roll all of this into one big electoral contest? I guess time will tell. That's where we will leave it for this episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. Coming up later this week, and maybe this is a potential springboard into an election, but big nonetheless, it sounds like on Thursday of this week, finally an agreement being announced between Alberta and Ottawa regarding energy development and specifically a potential new pipeline to the West Coast. So it looks like Thursday's the big day. We'll have much more on that coming up later this week. In the meantime, much more at robbreakenridge.ca. Thank you so much for joining us on the Rob Breakenridge Show. We'll talk to you next time. Take care. Hey, folks, thanks for watching and listening. You can find us at robbreakenridge.ca. Also, make sure you hit that subscribe button below and stay connected with the Rob Breakenridge Show.